Jake McKinnon's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as he stared through his kitchen window at the impossible sight outside. 70 black SUVs sat in perfect formation across his Montana ranch, each vehicle gleaming in the dawn light like a funeral procession that had lost its way. This wasn't the welcoming committee he'd expected after giving away Duke yesterday. His German shepherd pressed against his leg, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. Duke knew danger when he smelled it. The white ribbons tied to each antenna fluttered in the morning breeze, creating an eerie uniformity that made Jake's retired cop instincts scream warnings he couldn't yet understand. 43 years wearing a badge had taught him that when this many people showed up unannounced, someone was either very grateful or very angry. His weathered hands trembled as he set down the cup, remembering Eleanor's tears when he'd left Duke with her broken body beside that overturned Mercedes. "Duke, what the hell did we walk into?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with the promise of answers that might destroy everything he thought he knew about yesterday's simple act of kindness. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The silence in Jake McKinnon's kitchen felt heavier than the Montana snow that had buried Martha's grave last winter. At 68, Jake had seen enough trouble to recognize it when it parked itself in his front yard, but nothing in his 43 years as a Montana State Police officer had prepared him for this kind of orchestrated intimidation. His modest ranch house sat on 12 acres of stubborn prairie grass, 20 minutes outside Billings on a road that most folks forgot existed. The mortgage notices stacked on his kitchen table reminded him daily that the bank owned more of this place than he did. $47,000. That's what stood between him and sleeping in his '94 Ford pickup, the same truck that had carried him and Duke on yesterday's fateful grocery run. Duke padded across the linoleum floor, his black and tan coat showing the silver threads that marked his 7 years. The German shepherd had been Martha's final gift, arriving just 3 weeks before the cancer finally claimed her voice. "Promise me you'll take care of each other," she'd whispered, her fingers buried in Duke's thick fur. Jake had promised, never imagining how literally Duke would take that responsibility. The foreclosure deadline sat 48 hours away, like a ticking bomb. Social Security stretched about as far as a rubber band in a hurricane, and his pride had kept him from calling his daughter Sarah in Sacramento. Last time they'd spoken, she'd made it clear that moving to California wasn't an option. "Dad, you can't bring that dog to my apartment complex," she'd said, as if Duke were some inconvenience rather than the breathing, loyal heart that kept Jake from following Martha into whatever comes after. Every morning started the same way. Coffee for 2, then the quiet ritual of putting 1 cup back in the cabinet. Duke watched this routine with understanding eyes, as if he knew that some habits died harder than hope. They'd walk to the mailbox together, Duke's protective instincts keeping him between Jake and the road, then check on the few head of cattle that Jake couldn't afford to feed properly but couldn't bear to sell. The empty medicine bottles on the kitchen counter told their own story. Blood pressure medication, arthritis pills, the heart medication Dr. Peterson insisted Jake needed, all gathering dust because choosing between pills and dog food wasn't really a choice at all. Duke ate first. Duke ate every day. Jake's chest pains could wait. "Been carrying this badge for 43 years, Jake murmured, his fingers unconsciously touching the empty space where his service weapon used to rest. "Never thought I'd need it to prove I'm worth saving." Duke's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, that unwavering attention that had kept Jake talking to someone, even if that someone had 4 legs and couldn't talk back. Yesterday's drive to town had changed everything. One woman, one moment of human decency, one decision that apparently had consequences Jake couldn't have imagined. Now, 70 vehicles full of strangers had turned his quiet desperation into something far more dangerous. Yesterday morning had started like any other Wednesday in Jake McKinnon's carefully ordered world of quiet desperation. The alarm clock beside his bed still buzzed at 5:30 a.m., a habit from 4 decades of police work that retirement couldn't break. Duke had already been awake, sitting by the bedroom door with the patient dignity that German shepherds wore like a uniform, waiting for Jake to acknowledge that another day had begun whether they wanted it or not. The drive to Billings for groceries had become a monthly ritual timed around Jake's Social Security check. $87 for food, $20 for gas, whatever was left went toward keeping the lights on. Duke rode shotgun in the '94 Ford pickup, his massive head hanging out the window, tongue lolling in the wind like he was still a puppy instead of a 7-year-old dog with silver threading through his muzzle. They'd taken the back road through Harper's Canyon, the scenic route that added 15 minutes but saved Jake from seeing the new subdivisions sprouting like weeds where cattle used to graze. Progress, folks called it. Jake called it the slow death of everything he'd loved about Montana. That's when they'd found her. The Mercedes sedan lay on its side in the drainage ditch like a wounded animal, expensive paint job scraped raw against the prairie rocks. Jake's cop instincts kicked in before his brain could catch up, pulling the truck over and grabbing the flashlight from his glove compartment. Duke was already out of the truck, nose to the ground, following a scent trail that led straight to the wreckage. Eleanor Hartwell was unconscious when Jake found her, blood seeping from a gash above her left temple. Her silver hair was matted with dirt, and something that might have been tears or might have been morning dew. She wore clothes that probably cost more than Jake's truck payment, but money couldn't stop physics when a car left the road at 60 miles per hour. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake's voice carried the authority of a man who'd talked people through their worst moments for most of his adult life. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, confused and frightened. Where am I?" Her voice was cultured, Eastern, nothing like the Montana drawl Jake was used to hearing. "You've been in an accident, ma'am. Don't try to move just yet." Jake's hands found the pulse point on her wrist, steady but weak. His fingers, weathered from years of outdoor work, looked like tree roots against her pale skin. Eleanor tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through her ribs. "My son. I need to call my son. He'll be worried." Jake glanced at his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in Harper's Canyon. The nearest ranch with a landline was 12 miles through rough country, and Eleanor needed medical attention that couldn't wait for Jake to hike there and back. That's when Duke made the decision for him. The German shepherd had been pacing around Eleanor, whining in that low, urgent way that dogs used when they sensed something humans couldn't. Suddenly Duke lay down beside Eleanor, pressing his warm body against her side. The woman's shivering stopped almost immediately. "He's trying to keep you warm," Jake realized aloud. "Smart dog. You're going into shock, and he knows it." Eleanor's hand found Duke's head, her fingers tangling in his thick fur. "Beautiful boy," she whispered. "Such a beautiful, brave boy." Jake looked at his truck, at Eleanor, at Duke. The math was simple and brutal. His truck wouldn't start. Hadn't been reliable for months. Eleanor needed immediate medical attention and warmth. The nearest help was a long walk through country that would kill an injured woman. "Duke," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "You stay with this lady. Keep her warm, you hear? I'll be back with help." Duke looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes, the kind of look that passed between partners who'd learned to trust each other completely. The dog settled more firmly against Eleanor's side, accepting his assignment. Jake pulled off his jacket and tucked it around Eleanor's shoulders. "Ma'am, my dog Duke is going to stay with you while I go for help. He's trained for this kind of thing." It wasn't exactly true, but Duke was acting like he knew exactly what to do. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered. "Why would you? You don't even know me." Jake stood, his knees protesting the movement. At 68, everything protested these days. "My Martha always said that's when it matters most, helping folks you don't know. Means it's real kindness, not just obligation." The walk to Henderson Ranch took 4 hours through country that tried to kill a man with every step. By the time Jake reached Bill Henderson's front door, his boots were held together with stubbornness and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. "Bill, I need your help," he gasped. "Woman's hurt bad in Harper's Canyon. Left my dog with her." Henderson took one look at Jake's face and reached for his keys. Bill Henderson's weathered face went white when he recognized the description of the Mercedes and its injured occupant. As they bounced through Harper's Canyon in Henderson's ranch truck, the older man's hands gripped the steering wheel like he was trying to strangle the truth out of it. "Jake, you don't understand what you've walked into," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been keeping secrets too long. "That woman you found, that's Eleanor Hartwell. Her boy Tom owns half the businesses in 3 states, and he's been looking for his mama for 10 years. The name hit Jake like a fist to the gut. Even in Montana, folks knew about the Hartwells. Old money, new power, the kind of family that made headlines when they sneezed. "What's she doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" "Running," Henderson said simply. From her son, from her past, from what happened to her daughter, Amy. As they approached the accident site, Jake could see Duke exactly where he'd left him, pressed against Eleanor's side like a living blanket. But Eleanor was sitting up now, conscious and alert, one hand buried in Duke's thick fur while she spoke to him in soft, urgent whispers. "There's my boy," Jake called out as he jumped from Henderson's truck. Duke's tail wagged once, a subtle acknowledgement, but he didn't leave Eleanor's side. Eleanor looked up at Jake with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been fear. "Your dog," she said, her voice stronger now. "He's remarkable. It's like he knew exactly what I needed." Henderson was already on his satellite phone, calling for an ambulance and speaking in the clipped tones of someone reporting an emergency. But Jake caught him saying something else, something about notifying the family, and felt ice form in his stomach. "Ma'am, we need to get you to a hospital," Jake said, kneeling beside Eleanor. "You might have internal injuries we can't see." "No hospitals," Eleanor said quickly, panic flashing across her features. "Please, if you take me to a hospital, he'll find me. Tom will find me, and I'm not ready for that conversation." Henderson finished his call and approached them with the expression of a man delivering bad news. "Ambulance is 20 minutes out, but I had to call it in through dispatch. Eleanor, your son's people monitor emergency frequencies. They'll know about this within the hour." Eleanor's grip on Duke's fur tightened. "Then I have maybe 2 hours before he arrives with his security team and his questions and his accusations." She looked at Jake with desperate eyes. "You don't understand. My son blames me for Amy's death. He thinks I killed her, as surely as if I'd been driving that car." "What happened to Amy?" Jake asked gently, recognizing the look of someone carrying unbearable guilt. Eleanor's voice broke as she spoke. 10 years ago, Amy died in a drunk driving accident. She was rushing to the hospital because I called her, told her I was having chest pains. I lied. I wasn't having chest pains. I was just lonely. It was Amy's anniversary with her boyfriend, and I couldn't bear the thought of spending another evening alone in that big house." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and choking. Henderson looked away, giving Eleanor what privacy he could. "Amy died trying to help me," Eleanor continued. "And Tom has never forgiven me. He hired investigators to find me when I disappeared 3 years ago. Not to reconcile, but to make me pay for what I did to his sister." In the distance, Jake could hear the wail of approaching sirens. Duke pressed closer to Eleanor, sensing her distress, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. This woman's guilt was a living thing, feeding on itself, growing stronger with each passing year. "Ma'am," Jake said quietly, "guilt's a hungry beast. I know because I've been feeding mine for 2 years, ever since my Martha died, and I couldn't save her." The ambulance crested the hill, its red lights painting the canyon walls like splashes of blood. Eleanor looked at Duke one more time, then at Jake. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you. I haven't felt this kind of kindness in so long. I'd forgotten what it was like." Jake stood as the paramedics approached, but he could feel something shifting in the air around them, like the pressure change before a storm. Billings General Hospital's fluorescent lights hummed like angry wasps as Jake sat in the emergency room waiting area, Duke pressed against his legs in that protective way German shepherds had when their world shifted into unknown territory. The antiseptic smell reminded Jake of those final weeks with Martha, when hope had become measured in morphine drips and the spaces between labored breaths. Eleanor was stable, the doctors assured him. Concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and a gash that would leave a scar, but nothing that time and proper care couldn't heal. What couldn't be stitched up was the look in her eyes when she'd grabbed Jake's hand as the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. "Please don't leave me alone when he comes," she'd whispered. "I know I have no right to ask, but I can't face Tom by myself. Not yet." Jake had promised, the way cops promised victims that everything would be okay even when they knew it probably wouldn't be. Some promises were about hope rather than certainty. Now, 3 hours later, Jake understood what Henderson had meant about walking into something bigger than himself. Eleanor's room had become command central for a security operation that would have impressed the Secret Service. Men in expensive suits spoke into earpieces, their eyes scanning the hallway like they expected an assassination attempt at any moment. "Mr. McKinnon?" A woman in her 30s approached, clipboard in hand and authority in her voice. "I'm Lisa Chen, Mr. Hartwell's executive assistant. He'd like to speak with you before he sees his mother." Jake looked down at Duke, who was watching the security team with the focused intensity of a working dog. "I reckon he knows where to find me." "Sir, Mr. Hartwell prefers to conduct his conversations in more controlled environments. He has a conference room reserved on the 4th floor." The way she said it made it sound like a request, but Jake's cop instincts recognized a command when he heard one. He'd dealt with powerful men before, the kind who thought money could buy them immunity from consequence and common courtesy. "Duke stays with me," Jake said simply. Lisa Chen glanced at the German shepherd, then back at Jake. "I'm not sure animals are allowed in the conference area." "Then Mr. Hartwell can come down here? Duke's not negotiable." 20 minutes later, Thomas Hartwell, Jr. entered the waiting room like a weather front moving across the plains. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military school and boardroom battles. At 45, he looked like a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with money or influence. His eyes found Jake immediately, cataloging everything from the worn boots to the flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Duke stood as Tom approached, not aggressive but alert, positioning himself between Jake and this newcomer who radiated tension like heat from a furnace. "Mr. McKinnon," Tom said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude for helping my mother." Jake studied Tom's face, looking for some resemblance to Eleanor's gentle features. The bone structure was there, but everything else had been hardened by years of anger and successful ruthlessness. "Just did what any decent person would do," Jake replied. "Your mother was hurt, needed help." "Yes, well, that's what I'd like to discuss with you." Tom gestured toward the elevators. "Privately. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Duke." Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. McKinnon, I don't think you understand the complexity of this situation. My mother has been missing for 3 years. 3 years of private investigators, of wondering if she was alive or dead, of not knowing if she needed help or was deliberately hiding from her family. The pain in Tom's voice was real, Jake realized. Whatever anger drove this man, it was built on a foundation of genuine hurt. "She's been running from you," Jake said quietly. "Seems to me she had her reasons. Did she tell you about Amy?" The question came out sharp as broken glass. "She mentioned your sister died in an accident." Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Accident? Yes, that's one way to put it. Amy died because our mother manipulated her into driving drunk to the hospital for a medical emergency that didn't exist. My sister died because my mother was lonely and selfish and couldn't stand the thought of Amy having a life that didn't revolve around her needs." Duke pressed closer to Jake's leg, sensing the rising tension. Jake kept his voice level, the way he'd learned to do when dealing with grieving relatives who needed someone to blame. "That's a heavy burden you're carrying, son. 10 years of anger can poison a man from the inside." "Don't," Tom said sharply. "Don't try to counsel me like I'm some grief-stricken victim. I've built a multinational corporation from the ground up. I employ 12,000 people across 6 countries. I don't need therapy from a retired small-town cop." The dismissal stung, but Jake had been dismissed by better men than Tom Hartwell. "What do you want from me?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You gave away your dog to keep my mother warm while you walked 12 miles for help. That's either the act of a genuinely selfless person or someone with an angle I haven't figured out yet." "No angle. Just couldn't let her die. Even though helping her has put you in an incredibly complicated position?" Jake frowned. "What kind of complicated position?" Tom smiled, and it was the kind of smile predators wore when they'd cornered their prey. "Mr. McKinnon, my mother has been declared legally incompetent due to her mental state following Amy's death. I have power of attorney over her medical decisions, her finances, and her living arrangements. Every person who has helped her remain hidden from her family has technically been interfering with a legal guardianship." The blood drained from Jake's face. "You're saying I broke the law by helping an injured woman?" "I'm saying that depends entirely on whether I choose to see it that way." Tom's voice was silk over steel. "You see, Mr. McKinnon, I've spent 3 years and considerable resources looking for my mother. Not to hurt her, but to get her the psychological help she needs. Her guilt over Amy's death has made her a danger to herself and others." Jake thought about Eleanor's desperate plea not to be taken to a hospital, her fear of being found. "She seemed pretty clear-headed to me." "Trauma can be deceptive. My mother is skilled at appearing functional for short periods, but she's attempted suicide twice since Amy's death. The second time, she nearly took an innocent bystander with her." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked down at Duke, remembering how the dog had immediately known what to do with Eleanor, how he'd positioned himself to keep her warm and calm. "What do you want?" Jake asked again. Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I want you to help me prove something, Mr. McKinnon. I've developed a theory about human nature over the past 10 years. I believe that genuine altruism is incredibly rare, that most people who appear to be good are actually motivated by self-interest, guilt, or the desire for recognition." Jake took the card without looking at it. "And? You intrigue me. A man who gives away his most valuable possession to save a stranger, then walks 12 miles through rough country to get help, asks nothing in return. That's either the behavior of a saint or someone with a very sophisticated long-term strategy. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned." Tom's smile widened. That's what I intend to find out. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove that your kindness was genuine. Think of it as a test of character, Mr. McKinnon. Pass it, and I'll ensure your financial troubles disappear. Fail it, and, well, he didn't finish the threat, but Jake heard it anyway. What kind of test? The kind that reveals who a person really is when everything they care about is at stake. Tom turned toward the elevator. My people will be in touch with details. Oh, and Mr. McKinnon, bring the dog. Something tells me he's going to be important to how this all plays out. The Hartwell Corporate Retreat Center rose from the Montana wilderness like something that didn't belong. All glass and steel angles carved into the mountainside 40 miles north of Billings. Jake's '94 Ford pickup wheezed up the winding access road, following a convoy of black SUVs that had materialized at his ranch at dawn with the precision of a military operation. Duke sat rigid in the passenger seat, every muscle tense with the kind of alertness that made Jake's cop instincts scream warnings. The German Shepherd had been restless all night, pacing Jake's small house like a caged animal, pausing frequently at windows to stare out at darkness that held secrets neither of them understood. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, though his own hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." The facility sprawled across 20 acres of pristine wilderness, its architecture designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning sky like mirrors, making it impossible to see inside. Security cameras perched on every corner like mechanical vultures, their lenses tracking Jake's truck as he followed the SUVs toward a parking area that could have accommodated a small army. Tom Hartwell stood waiting at the main entrance, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the fluid readiness of professional bodyguards. Behind them, visible through the glass lobby, Jake could see more people moving with the purposeful efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. "Mr. McKinnon," Tom said, as Jake climbed stiffly from his truck. "Thank you for coming. I trust you slept well?" Jake hadn't slept at all, but he wasn't about to give Tom that satisfaction. "Well enough. Where's your mother?" "Eleanor is resting comfortably in our medical facility. She'll join us shortly." Tom's smile was all sharp edges and hidden meanings. "I'm eager for you to see what we've prepared." Duke jumped down from the truck and immediately positioned himself between Jake and Tom's security team. The dog's hackles weren't raised, but his ears were forward and his eyes tracked every movement with the intensity of a professional sentry. "Impressive animal," Tom observed. "German Shepherds are remarkable for their loyalty and intelligence. They'll protect their pack even against impossible odds." The way he said it made Jake's skin crawl, like Tom was discussing a weapon rather than a companion. The lobby of the retreat center was all polished marble and abstract art, the kind of corporate luxury that was designed to remind visitors how much money the Hartwell family had and how little their problems mattered in comparison. But Jake's trained eye picked out details that didn't belong in any corporate retreat. Reinforced door frames, security glass, and sight lines that were too carefully controlled. "This way, please," Tom said, leading them toward an elevator bank. "I want to show you something that will help you understand the scope of today's exercise." The elevator carried them to the 4th floor in silence broken only by the soft whir of machinery and Duke's steady breathing. When the doors opened, Jake found himself looking into what could only be described as a command center. Banks of monitors lined the walls, displaying feeds from dozens of security cameras. Maps covered planning tables marked with colored pins and overlaid with tactical notations. And there, displayed on the largest screen, was an aerial view of Jake's ranch house with every building, fence line, and access road marked in meticulous detail. "Surveillance is a necessary tool in modern security," Tom said, noticing Jake's expression. "When someone becomes involved with my family, I need to understand who they are and what motivates them." Jake stared at the screen, recognizing the view from directly above his property. "How long have you been watching me?" Since yesterday afternoon when my people identified you as the man who helped my mother." Tom moved to stand beside Jake, close enough that Duke shifted to maintain his protective position. 72 hours of observation can tell you remarkable things about a person's character. The casual admission hit Jake like ice water. 72 hours? But I only met Eleanor yesterday morning. Tom's smile was patient, condescending. "Mr. McKinnon, do you really think it was coincidence that my mother's car went off the road exactly where a retired police officer would be driving by? That the one person in 50 miles of empty countryside who would stop to help happened to be someone with the training and moral compass to actually follow through?" The implications crashed over Jake like an avalanche. "You're saying the accident was staged?" "I'm saying my mother has been under protective surveillance for 3 years, ever since her second suicide attempt, when she disabled her tracking device and disappeared from her supervised living facility in Denver 2 weeks ago. We knew she was heading for Montana. We've been monitoring every road, every possible route she might take." Jake felt Duke press against his leg, anchoring him as the room seemed to tilt on its axis. "So when I found her..." "You found her exactly where we expected you to find her. The accident was real enough. Eleanor has never been a particularly skilled driver, and the sedatives she'd been taking affected her reaction time, but the timing, the location, your presence..." Tom spread his hands. "Let's call it orchestrated serendipity." The betrayal cut deeper than Jake had expected. Yesterday's simple act of human kindness had been manipulated from the beginning, turned into something calculated and cold. But even as anger rose in his throat, another part of his mind was working the problem like the cop he'd once been. "What do you want from me?" Tom walked to a planning table covered with photographs and documents. Jake could see his own image repeated dozens of times, getting his mail, feeding Duke, sitting on his porch in the evening light. The invasion of privacy was complete and methodical. "I want to offer you a choice, Mr. McKinnon. The same choice my mother faced 10 years ago when Amy called asking for help." Tom picked up a remote control and activated a wall-mounted screen. Eleanor appeared, sitting in what looked like a comfortable medical facility room. She was awake, dressed in clean clothes, and appeared unharmed, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd been crying for hours. "Mom looks good, doesn't she?" Tom's voice carried an edge that made Duke's ears flatten slightly. "Clean, safe, well-fed, all the medical attention she needs. But she's alone, Mr. McKinnon, completely alone, just like she was the night she lied to Amy about having chest pains." Jake watched Eleanor on the screen, recognizing the posture of someone who'd given up hope. "What choice are you talking about?" Tom activated another screen, this one showing a split image. On the left was Jake's ranch house. On the right was the parking lot outside, where the 70 black SUVs sat in perfect formation. "Each of those vehicles contains a person who volunteered to be here today," Tom said. 70 people who've agreed to participate in what I call the worthiness protocol. They're all facing genuine crises, Mr. McKinnon. Medical bills they can't pay, foreclosures they can't stop, legal troubles they can't resolve. Jake's mouth went dry. "What kind of volunteers?" "The desperate kind. Single mothers facing eviction. Veterans with PTSD who can't hold jobs. Elderly people choosing between medication and food. People very much like yourself, actually." The screen changed again, showing individual faces. Jake saw pain and fear and hopelessness in every photograph. The kind of desperation that made people agree to things they would never consider under normal circumstances. "I've offered each of them a way out of their problems," Tom continued. "Complete resolution of their crisis in exchange for participating in today's exercise. They don't know the full scope of what they've agreed to, of course. That would compromise the integrity of the test." "What test?" Jake demanded, though he was beginning to understand that he didn't want to hear the answer. Tom's smile was the coldest thing Jake had ever seen. "The same test my mother failed 10 years ago. The test of whether someone will sacrifice innocent people to get what they want." He activated a final screen showing a detailed floor plan of the facility. Red dots marked locations throughout the building, each one labeled with a name and a brief description. Sarah Chen, stage 4 cancer, no insurance. Marcus Rodriguez, foreclosure notice, 3 children. Betty Williams, husband needs dialysis, Medicare denied. You're going to choose 5 of those 70 people, Mr. McKinnon. 5 people who will face genuine life-threatening challenges to prove your worthiness to have helped my mother. Think of it as payment for your good deed. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "You're talking about killing people." "I'm talking about the same choice my mother made when she called Amy that night. She put someone else's life at risk to get what she wanted. Amy died because my mother was selfish. Today you get to decide if you're any different." Duke was growling now, a low rumble that spoke of violence held in check by training and loyalty. Jake's hand found the dog's head, drawing strength from the contact. "And if I refuse?" Tom's expression didn't change. "Then you'll have proven that your help yesterday was meaningless, a gesture without substance. And my mother will spend the rest of her life in a secure facility, knowing that the one person who showed her kindness was just as selfish as she was." The screens around the room flickered, showing live feeds from throughout the facility. 70 people sat in comfortable chairs, some reading, others talking quietly among themselves. None of them looked like they understood they were waiting to discover if a stranger would choose them to die. "How long do I have to decide?" Jake asked. Tom checked his watch. "The exercise begins in 1 hour. That should give you time to meet some of your potential choices. I find it helps to put faces to the names." Jake looked at Eleanor on the screen, then at Duke, then at the faces of 70 strangers who'd trusted the wrong person with their desperation. The weight of impossible choices settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "There's a third option, isn't there?" Jake said quietly. Tom's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd ask. Yes, Mr. McKinnon, there is a third option, but I don't think you're going to like it any more than the first 2. The conference room where Tom led Jake felt more like a courtroom than a corporate meeting space. 70 chairs arranged in precise rows faced a raised platform where Tom stood like a prosecutor delivering opening arguments to a jury that had already been bought and paid for. Each chair held a person whose desperation had made them vulnerable to Tom's twisted version of charity. Jake's eyes moved across the faces, cataloging the kind of quiet suffering that came from fighting battles no one else could see. In the front row sat Sarah Chen, a woman in her 40s whose silk scarf couldn't quite hide the telltale signs of chemotherapy. Next to her, Marcus Rodriguez clutched a manila folder that probably contained foreclosure papers, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he tried to maintain composure in front of his teenage daughter. Duke pressed against Jake's leg, his training evident in the way he positioned himself to watch both the crowd and Tom simultaneously. The German Shepherd's instincts were screaming warnings that Jake's rational mind was still trying to process. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom began, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and bending others to his will. "Thank you all for participating in today's exercise. As I explained when you volunteered, this is a character assessment designed to determine the worthiness of certain individuals to receive assistance." An elderly woman in the 3rd row raised her hand tentatively. Betty Williams, according to the file Jake had seen, whose husband needed dialysis treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. "Mr. Hartwell, you said there might be some risk involved, but you weren't specific about what kind of risk." Tom's smile was patient but cold. "The risk, Mrs. Williams, is proportional to the reward. Each of you faces financial or medical crises that could destroy your lives. I'm offering complete resolution of those problems in exchange for your participation in proving whether true altruism exists." Jake found his voice. "These people don't know what you're really asking of them, don't they?" Tom turned to face the assembled volunteers. "How many of you would risk your life for $50,000, $100,000, complete medical coverage for a terminal illness?" Hands began rising throughout the room, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. Sarah Chen's hand went up immediately, followed by Marcus Rodriguez, then Betty Williams. Within moments, nearly every person in the room had volunteered to risk their life for the promise of salvation from their individual hells. The sight made Jake's stomach clench. These weren't volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were victims of a system that had failed them so completely that Russian roulette with a billionaire seemed like reasonable odds. "You see, Mr. McKinnon," Tom said, turning back to Jake, "desperation creates its own form of consent. Every person in this room has already agreed to risk everything because they have nothing left to lose." Duke's growl was barely audible, but Jake felt the vibration through the dog's chest where it pressed against his leg. The German Shepherd was reading the room's emotional temperature with the precision of a trained professional, and what he sensed was making him prepare for violence. Tom activated a wall screen that showed 5 different locations within the facility. The tests are simple in concept, complex in execution. Each volunteer I select will face a challenge specifically designed to match their capabilities and limitations. The first location appeared to be a swimming pool, except the water was black and the lighting was minimal. "Mrs. Chen, despite your ongoing chemotherapy, you were a competitive swimmer in college. This challenge would require you to retrieve an object from the bottom of a 12-foot pool in complete darkness." Sarah Chen's face went white. I haven't been in water since my treatment started. The chemicals, the weakness in my muscles," "which makes it a genuine test of whether Mr. McKinnon's worthiness justifies the risk," Tom replied smoothly. The second screen showed what looked like a rock-climbing wall, except the handholds were spaced at distances that would challenge even a healthy person. "Mr. Rodriguez, your construction background gives you the upper body strength necessary for this challenge despite your recent injury." Marcus Rodriguez unconsciously flexed his left shoulder, where Jake could now see the telltale signs of someone favoring an old injury. "Mr. Hartwell, I haven't been cleared for heavy physical activity since my fall last month." "Precisely why it's a test rather than a certainty." Jake watched in horror as Tom displayed 3 more challenges, each one calibrated to push someone beyond their physical or psychological limits. An elderly veteran with PTSD would have to navigate a maze filled with sounds and lighting designed to trigger flashbacks. A woman with severe claustrophobia would have to crawl through an increasingly narrow tunnel system. A man with a heart condition would have to complete a series of high-stress physical tasks while monitored for cardiac episodes. "This is insane," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to talk jumpers off bridges. "These people need help, not exploitation." Tom's expression didn't change. "These people need exactly what you needed yesterday, Mr. McKinnon. The opportunity to prove their worth through sacrifice. The difference is that you chose to make the sacrifice. Today, you'll choose who makes it for you." The room had gone silent except for the sound of 70 people breathing and the subtle whir of air conditioning. Jake could feel their eyes on him, some hopeful, others fearful, all of them trapped in a situation that shouldn't exist in any sane world. "What's the third option?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Tom's smile was triumphant. "You take all 5 challenges yourself, right now. Prove that your willingness to help my mother was genuine by putting your own life at risk instead of forcing others to do it for you." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Jake looked at the faces around him, then at Duke, whose brown eyes held the kind of steady loyalty that had kept Jake breathing for 2 years after Martha's death. And if I refuse all three options, then everyone in this room goes home with nothing. My mother remains convinced that kindness is an illusion, and you'll have proven that yesterday's heroics were just the actions of a man looking for recognition rather than genuinely trying to help. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, hearing Martha's voice from a memory that felt both distant and immediate. Real courage isn't about being unafraid, Jake. It's about doing what's right, even when everything inside you is screaming to run. When he opened his eyes, Jake's decision was written across his face with the kind of finality that comes from a lifetime of difficult choices. Duke sensed it immediately, pressing closer to his partner's leg in a gesture that was both protective and supportive. "I'll take the challenges," Jake said quietly. "All 5. But I want something in return." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Every person in this room gets their problem solved regardless of whether I survive your tests, and your mother gets to choose where she lives and how she spends whatever time she has left." The room erupted in whispers as 70 desperate people realized they might be witnessing either their salvation or a good man's suicide. Tom studied Jake's face for a long moment, looking for any sign of doubt or calculation. "Agreed," Tom said finally. "Though I should warn you, Mr. McKinnon, only 12 people have ever attempted all 5 challenges. None of them survived." The first challenge began in the facility's basement, where Tom had constructed what he called the Pool of Truth. The water was pitch black, treated with harmless dye that made it impossible to see more than 6 inches below the surface. Somewhere at the bottom, 12 feet down, lay a weighted box containing the key to the next challenge. Jake stood at the pool's edge, feeling the weight of 70 pairs of eyes watching from the observation deck above. Duke had been separated from him despite his protests, led away by security guards to what Tom assured him was a comfortable holding area. The German shepherd's absence felt like losing an arm. "The water temperature is 58 degrees, Tom announced through the intercom system. "Cold enough to cause hypothermia if you remain submerged too long, but not immediately fatal. You have 10 minutes to locate and retrieve the key, or this challenge ends in failure." Eleanor's face appeared on a monitor beside the pool, her expression anguished as she realized what Tom was forcing Jake to endure. "Please don't do this," she whispered, though Jake couldn't tell if she was speaking to him or to her son. "This isn't worth it. I'm not worth it." Jake pulled off his boots and shirt, his 68-year-old body looking pale and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights. The scars on his chest from a knife fight 20 years earlier stood out like a road map of violence survived, and the arthritis in his joints protested the cold air. "Martha," he whispered to himself, "if you're watching, help me find my way back to Duke." The water hit him like a fist of ice, stealing his breath and sending shockwaves through muscles that hadn't been tested this way in decades. Jake forced himself to dive deep, hands reaching blindly through liquid darkness while his lungs burned and his heart hammered against his ribs. The first 3 dives yielded nothing but disorientation and the growing certainty that his body was failing him. On the 4th attempt, his fingers brushed against something metallic, but the cold had made him clumsy, and the object slipped away into the black depths. Time was running out. Jake could feel hypothermia beginning to affect his coordination, his movements becoming sluggish and imprecise. On his final dive, using the last of his strength and the last of his air, his hand closed around the weighted box just as his vision began to tunnel. He broke the surface, gasping, barely conscious, the key clutched in his fist like salvation. The second challenge waited in what Tom called the Wall of Redemption, a rock-climbing structure that stretched 30 feet toward the ceiling. But This wasn't a standard climbing wall. The handholds were positioned to test not just strength, but the specific weaknesses that came with age and injury. Jake's hands were still numb from the pool, his core temperature dangerously low when they strapped him into the climbing harness. The safety rope would prevent a fatal fall, but it wouldn't prevent the kind of injuries that could end the challenges permanently. "Your target is the red button at the top," Tom's voice crackled through speakers positioned around the climbing area. "You have 15 minutes, but I should warn you that the handholds become increasingly unstable as you climb higher." The first 10 feet were manageable, muscle memory from his youth carrying Jake upward despite the trembling in his arms. But at 15 feet, his grip began to fail. The cold water had sapped his strength, and the handholds were designed to test the limits of what an elderly man could accomplish. Jake fell twice, the safety rope catching him each time with jarring force that sent pain shooting through his shoulders and back. On the third attempt, he made it to 25 feet before his body simply refused to continue. Hanging from the rope, barely conscious from exhaustion and pain, Jake heard something that changed everything. From somewhere in the facility came the sound of Duke barking, not the casual bark of a dog seeking attention, but the urgent, commanding bark of a working dog alerting to danger. The sound gave Jake strength he didn't know he possessed. Duke was calling to him, reminding him that surrender wasn't an option as long as they had each other. Jake climbed the final 5 feet on pure determination, slapping the red button with his last conscious act before his grip failed completely. The third challenge was psychological, designed to exploit the trauma that every law enforcement officer carried from decades of witnessing humanity at its worst. Tom had created what he called the Chamber of Echoes, a room filled with speakers that played a carefully curated symphony of every sound Jake would want to forget. Gunshots, screaming, the wet sound of impact from fatal car accidents, the cries of children who couldn't be saved, the last words of victims whose cases had gone cold. For 30 minutes, Jake had to remain in the chamber and locate 5 hidden buttons while the sounds of his professional failures surrounded him like vengeful ghosts. The fourth challenge tested claustrophobia in a tunnel system that grew progressively narrower, forcing Jake to crawl on his belly through spaces barely wider than his shoulders. His injured back screamed with every movement, and twice he became wedged in passages so tight that panic threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. But each time despair reached for him, Jake heard Duke's voice in his memory. The soft whine the German shepherd made when he sensed Jake's depression, the gentle pressure of a large head resting on Jake's lap during the darkest nights after Martha's death. The final challenge was the cruelest of all. Tom had designed it specifically to exploit Jake's deepest fear, the fear of failing someone who depended on him for protection. The simulator of loss was a virtual reality system that placed Jake in scenarios where he had to choose which innocent person to save, knowing that his choice would doom the others. The technology was sophisticated enough to make the scenarios feel completely real, flooding Jake's nervous system with stress hormones as he watched digital people die because of his decisions. But as Jake reached the breaking point, as the simulated deaths piled up around him and his mind began to fracture under the weight of impossible choices, something unexpected happened. And the facility's lights flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in red light. But in that moment of darkness, Jake heard something that made his heart stop. Duke's bark, closer now, filled with the kind of rage that German shepherds reserve for genuine threats to their pack. The observation deck erupted in chaos as security guards shouted conflicting orders. Tom's voice came through the speakers, tight with control that was beginning to crack. "Lockdown protocol! Lockdown protocol! All personnel to secure positions." Jake ripped off the virtual reality headset, his vision swimming with exhaustion and dehydration, just in time to see Duke burst through the reinforced door of the challenge room. The German Shepherd had somehow escaped his holding area, and the way he moved suggested he wasn't alone. Behind Duke came Marcus Washington, one of the 70 volunteers, but Marcus was no longer playing the role of desperate victim. He moved with the fluid precision of someone with military training, and in his hand was a smartphone that had been recording everything. "Mr. McKinnon," Marcus called out, "I'm Master Sergeant Marcus Washington, U.S. Army Special Forces, retired. I've been documenting Mr. Hartwell's operation for the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division." The room spun around Jake as the implications hit him. "You're not really here for help?" "I'm here because 3 other people died in facilities like this one over the past 2 years. Tom Hartwell has been using his wealth to create elaborate psychological experiments on vulnerable people, and the FBI has been building a case against him for months." Duke reached Jake and pressed against his legs, solid and warm and real in a way that anchored Jake to sanity. The German Shepherd was unharmed but agitated, his training evident in the way he positioned himself between Jake and the chaos erupting around them. Tom's voice echoed through the facility's speaker system, but now it carried the edge of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "You don't understand what I'm trying to prove. People need to be tested. They need to prove their worth, or kindness becomes meaningless." Eleanor's voice came through clearly for the first time, transmitted from her holding room to every speaker in the facility. "Tom, please. This isn't about Amy anymore. This isn't about me. This is about the man you've become, and Amy would be heartbroken to see what her death has done to you." The psychological warfare had backfired. Tom's elaborate test of human nature had revealed something about himself that he wasn't prepared to face. That his quest for meaning in his sister's death had turned him into the kind of monster who tortured innocent people for the sake of philosophical abstractions. Jake collapsed to his knees beside Duke, his body finally surrendering to the trauma of the challenges. But as consciousness began to fade, he felt the warm weight of the German Shepherd pressed against him and heard Eleanor's voice continuing to speak to her son with the kind of love that persisted even through years of mutual destruction. "Tom," she was saying, "I killed Amy with my selfishness, and you've been killing yourself with your anger. But this man, this beautiful, brave man, he didn't hesitate to help me because that's who he is. Don't let your pain turn his kindness into something ugly." The last thing Jake saw before exhaustion claimed him was Duke's steady brown eyes, filled with the kind of loyalty that had kept him alive for 2 years and would keep him alive for whatever came next. 6 months later, Jake McKinnon sat on the front porch of his ranch house, watching Duke chase a tennis ball across the yard with the kind of energy that veterinary cancer treatments had given back to him. The German Shepherd's remission was holding steady, and the specialists in Denver said he might have 3 good years ahead of him instead of the 3 months they'd initially feared. The mortgage notices were gone from Jake's kitchen table, replaced by letters from grateful families whose lives had been changed by the Hartwell Foundation's new direction. Eleanor had insisted on paying off Jake's house as part of what she called restitution for what my son put you through. But more importantly, she'd asked Jake to help her transform Tom's twisted experiments into genuine assistance for people in crisis. The 70 people who'd been manipulated into Tom's final test had each received full resolution of their problems, but the real change went deeper than money. Marcus Washington had become the Foundation's director of field operations, using his military training and FBI connections to identify families who needed help without the psychological games that had characterized Tom's approach. "Jake, you've got visitors," Eleanor called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth that had replaced years of self-imposed isolation. She'd moved into Martha's old sewing room 3 months ago, initially just for the winter while her own place was being renovated, but both she and Jake had discovered that living alone wasn't necessary when you'd found family in unexpected places. A familiar black sedan was pulling into the driveway, but this time it carried hope instead of threats. Tom Hartwell stepped out of the passenger side, moving with the careful precision of someone still learning to navigate the world without armor. 6 months of intensive therapy had changed him in ways that money couldn't buy, stripping away the corporate veneer to reveal a man trying to figure out how to live with grief instead of being consumed by it. "Mr. McKinnon," Tom said, approaching the porch with Duke watching from beside Jake's chair. The German shepherd's tail wagged once, a cautious acknowledgement that this particular threat had evolved into something resembling safety. "Just Jake, son. We've been through too much for formalities." Tom nodded, settling into the chair Eleanor had positioned beside Jake's. The view from the porch stretched across 20 acres of Montana grassland toward mountains that had witnessed generations of people learning to forgive each other and themselves. "The prosecutor wants to know if you'll testify at the sentencing hearing next week," Tom said. "Though my lawyer thinks the plea agreement will hold either way." Jake studied Tom's profile, noting the way the younger man's shoulders no longer carried the rigid tension that had defined him during those terrible hours at the facility. 18 months in minimum security federal prison, 5 years of supervised probation, and the requirement that all of his business dealings be monitored by court-appointed oversight seemed like justice, though Jake suspected the real punishment was the knowledge of what Tom had become in his grief. "I'll testify if you want me to," Jake said. "But what I'll tell them is that you're not the same man who put me through those tests. Grief can turn good people into monsters, but it doesn't mean they have to stay monsters." Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee and the kind of homemade cookies that had become her signature contribution to their unlikely household. At 72, she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to value each day instead of enduring it. "Tom, I made your favorite," she said, setting down a plate of oatmeal cookies that carried the scent of cinnamon and second chances. "Though I still think you need to eat more vegetables." The ordinary maternal concern in her voice was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Eleanor had spent 3 years punishing herself for Amy's death, convinced that she didn't deserve to be anyone's mother. Tom's twisted tests had inadvertently forced both of them to confront the difference between guilt that motivated change and guilt that motivated destruction. "How's the foundation work going?" Tom asked, accepting the coffee with hands that no longer trembled with suppressed rage. Jake pulled a folder from the table beside his chair, filled with photographs and letters from families whose lives had been touched by what they now called practical kindness instead of worthiness testing. The difference wasn't just semantic, it represented a fundamental shift from judgment to assistance, from testing people's value to recognizing their inherent dignity. "Last month we helped 43 families," Jake said, flipping through images of people whose stories had become personal to him. Sarah Chen finished her cancer treatments and started a support group for other patients. Marcus Rodriguez got his contractor's license back and hired 3 other men from the original 70. Betty Williams and her husband celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary last week. Tom listened with the kind of attention that comes from understanding that redemption is measured in other people's healing rather than your own comfort. His therapist had helped him recognize that his need to test people's worthiness had really been about testing whether he deserved to be loved despite his failures with Amy. Duke wandered over to the group, settling at Tom's feet in a gesture that still surprised everyone. The German shepherd's capacity for forgiveness had proven more advanced than any human therapy, recognizing something in Tom that even Tom was still learning to see. "He's remarkable," Tom said, scratching behind Duke's ears with the careful reverence of someone who'd learned to appreciate unconditional loyalty. "The way he knew you were in trouble at the facility, how he escaped from that locked room to find help, it's like he understood the stakes better than any of us." Jake smiled, remembering the veterinarian's explanation of Duke's training. Martha had arranged everything, working with specialists during her final weeks to ensure that Duke would be more than just a companion. He'd be a lifeline when Jake needed him most. Martha always said that love finds a way to protect what matters, Jake said. She couldn't stay to take care of me, but she made sure Duke could. Eleanor settled into her own chair, her fingers finding the knitting project that had become her meditation. She was making blankets for the children's hospital, each one carrying the kind of love she'd been unable to give Amy in those final selfish years. "I got a letter from Amy's college roommate yesterday," she said quietly. "She's getting married next spring and wanted me to know that Amy would have been her maid of honor. She asked if I'd consider taking that role instead." The offer represented something Eleanor had thought impossible. The chance to honor Amy's memory through connection rather than isolation. For 10 years, she'd believed that loving anyone else would diminish the weight of her guilt over Amy's death. Now she was learning that love multiplied when shared, even when it carried the scars of loss. "Are you going to do it?" Tom asked, his voice carrying hope that had been absent for too many years. "I think I am. Amy would want me to be part of life instead of hiding from it." Eleanor's fingers moved steadily through the knitting pattern, creating something useful from separate threads. "And I think she'd like knowing that her death led to something better instead of just more pain." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, painting the scene with the golden light that photographers called the magic hour. Jake felt Martha's presence in moments like this, not as grief, but as gratitude for the love that had prepared him for whatever came after. Duke stirred, his head lifting in that alert way that meant he'd detected something the humans had missed. A moment later, Jake heard the sound of vehicles approaching, not the ominous convoy of 6 months ago, but the cheerful chaos of Marcus Washington's family arriving for their weekly Sunday dinner. Marcus's wife, Carol, emerged from their minivan with arms full of casserole dishes, followed by their 3 children, who immediately ran toward Duke with the kind of fearless affection that children reserved for dogs they trusted completely. The German Shepherd's tail began wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd discovered that protecting one family had led to being adopted by several. "Hope y'all are hungry," Carol called out. "I made enough food for half of Montana." These Sunday gatherings had evolved naturally, starting with Marcus's need to check on Jake's recovery and growing into something that filled the silence in Jake's house with the kind of noise that meant family. Tom joined them when his therapy schedule allowed, learning to be an uncle to children who didn't know he'd once been someone to fear. As the group moved toward the house for dinner, Jake lingered on the porch for a moment with Duke pressed against his legs. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely widower facing foreclosure, convinced that his capacity for love had died with Martha. Now he was surrounded by people whose lives had become intertwined through crisis and kindness, creating something stronger than what any of them had lost. "You know what the best part is, Duke?" Jake asked, scratching the German Shepherd's head. "Martha was right. Love does multiply when you give it away. I thought giving you to Eleanor meant losing everything I had left. Instead, I found out I had more love to give than I ever imagined." Duke's tail wagged once, a simple acknowledgement that some truths were too obvious for elaborate responses. The German Shepherd had always understood what the humans were still learning, that family wasn't just blood, but the decision to love someone every day, especially when they couldn't love themselves. Through the kitchen window, Jake could see Eleanor helping Carol set the table while Tom played a careful game of tag with Marcus's youngest daughter. The scene looked like every family dinner in America, except that it had been built from the wreckage of loss and the stubborn human insistence on finding meaning and kindness. "Come on, boy," Jake said, standing and stretching muscles that no longer ached with arthritis thanks to the medical coverage the foundation provided. "Let's go have dinner with our family." Duke bounded toward the door, his enthusiasm a reminder that sometimes the best things in life were as simple as knowing you belonged somewhere, with people who would choose to love you every single day. Sometimes we think our story is over when we lose the people who defined our world. Jake McKinnon thought his capacity for love died with Martha, that his remaining years would be measured in loneliness and financial struggle. At 68, facing foreclosure and estrangement from his children, he had only Duke, his loyal German shepherd, as proof that he still mattered to someone. But when Jake gave away his most precious companion to save a stranger, he discovered something remarkable. Love doesn't diminish when we share it. It multiplies. His simple act of kindness created a ripple effect that brought him Eleanor, who needed a family as much as he did, and Tom, who needed to learn that healing was possible even after years of destructive grief. Today, Jake's kitchen table holds letters from grateful families instead of foreclosure notices, his house echoes with Sunday dinners instead of silence, and Duke thrives in a pack that includes adopted grandchildren and found siblings. The greatest gift of our golden years isn't retirement. It's the wisdom to recognize that our deepest capacity for love often emerges when we think we have nothing left to give. Discussion questions. Have you ever discovered that an act of kindness led to unexpected blessings in your own life? What relationships have you found or deepened after age 55 that surprised you with their importance? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.